This is the Legacy Radio Network. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. This is the Everything Financial Radio Show. Glad you're with us today. We are chatting with prolific economic commentator, Mr. Karl Denninger. Karl, in the segment before last, we talked about the fact that Europe is trying to prop up Greece, but we have Portugal, Italy, and Spain standing in line behind them, maybe taking a look at the way that's handled, because those countries are obviously on the same slippery slope that Greece found themselves not that long ago. But when you look at the size of the deficits in each of these European countries and compare it to the United States, since our listeners are all here in the United States, can you comment on the size of the eventual problem in the United States as compared to the size of the problem in Europe if we don't get our deficits under control, and how that might play out in your opinion?
Let's put this in perspective. The Greek budget deficit was actually smaller in terms of their economy than our budget deficit is now. Now, that ought to make people sit down and think for a minute. We have, for the last 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, last 4 years, we have spent at the federal level approximately 10% of gross domestic product more than was taken in taxes. In other words, the budget deficit has been about 10% of GDP, somewhere between 9 and 12 for the last 4 years running. What this has done is created false demand in the economy. In other words, we have borrowed money in order to continue to spend and consume at a level that appears to be something more than what it really is. And this is what got Greece in trouble. This is going to come here. We have a tremendous problem in this country in that for the last 30 years, our politicians have made promises to people that cannot be kept. You continually hear things like, if you are 50 or older, your Medicare will not change. That is a lie. You hear things like Social Security doesn't really have a problem. That is a lie. You hear things like we can provide welfare and food stamps and Section 8 housing and a huge military and all of these other things that everybody wants without having to raise taxes. In fact, we should cut taxes like we recently did with the Social Security tax with that cut in the part that you supposedly contribute. That, too, is a lie. All of these things are lies. And the longer this goes on, the worse the problem gets, because when you are adding to the debt, the obligation that you're taking on grows at a compounded rate because the interest rises even if you stop the spending. So the only way this problem ever gets resolved, here, Europe, anywhere else, is when you stop spending more than you take in. And in 2000, this would have required about a 10% cut in the size of the federal budget. When I started writing prolifically about this in 2007, it was about 20%. Today it is half.
So the longer we kick the can down the road, the bigger the problem becomes. And I'm reminded of the saying that economist Herbert Stein made famous, and that is that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. This is obviously in that category. This cannot go on forever. So, Karl, in your view, when does it stop?
Mathematically speaking, the medical care explosion in cost alone within the federal government went from $53 billion in 1980 to over $800 billion last year. Just on that side of the ledger alone, within the next 15 years, medical spending by the federal government will consume all of the money that the federal government spends today. That is not going to happen. Somewhere before that point in time, the market will throw up and say, okay, we're done with buying your credit instruments, and the United States federal government and our economy will collapse, much as is happening over in Greece. The factual matter is that if you talk to the people in the Deficit Commission, and their opinion jives with mine, which is that the wall is no more than 4 to 5 years out, and there are a number of people who believe we won't make it past 2 years. I suspect that there will be the glint of recognition will start to show up before we get through the election. Of course, everybody's trying to, all the machinations that have been going on with the debt ceiling and everything else were to try to keep this out of the public view during the election process for this year. Just like in 2008, when they thought they could get away with maintaining the housing bubble until after John McCain had been elected, didn't work out very well. I don't think it will this time either.
Karl, when you look at the talking heads on the news, and they report that the economy is getting better, we're seeing economic growth, The unemployment rate is down. This past week, Fed Chairman Bernanke, in some testimony, said that the unemployment rate will not keep dropping. And, Karl, he probably knows that the unemployment rate, the headline number anyway, the reported number, the number that everybody talks about, is not necessarily the accurate number due to the way that the policymakers have changed the unemployment calculation formula over the years. I know you write a lot about the percentage of the adult working age population that are actually employed, and when you look at that measurement or metric versus the unemployment rate, you get two very different results. Can you comment?
Sure. The only thing that matters is the employment participation ratio. That is the number of people employed adjusted for the working age population. If you think about it, the population of the country goes up about 1% a year. So in order for everything to just stay stable, the number of people that are employed has to go up by about 1% a year. Well, there's 330 million people in the country, so we need to put about 3 million jobs into the economy every year just to maintain stability. That hasn't happened. We are now in the second full year beyond that point, so we're starting year 3, where the number of people employed as a percentage of the population has been absolutely stagnant, and we're back to the place where we were before women started to enter the workforce en masse in the early 1980s. This is a huge, huge problem for two reasons. Number one is that from a standpoint of government fiscal sustainability, only employed people pay taxes. That's the most important thing to remember. Unemployed people don't pay taxes. They suck on government benefits. Secondly, you as an individual, if you're unemployed, have jack for purchasing power and the ability to financially and personally advance yourself. So in order for us to have economic growth and economic prosperity, the labor participation rate has to be going up, and it's going down. We have made no progress in this regard whatsoever since President Obama took office. Absolutely none.
Karl, we have a few minutes left in this segment. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other economic reporting formulas that maybe aren't calculated the way they used to be, and maybe they aren't as accurate as they used to be. Can you talk about your views on inflation? Certainly with gas prices going up, you've seen prices at the grocery store go up, yet the value of a lot of things we own, like homes, for example, have gone down. Can you sort out all this for the listeners? What is the real inflation rate? Are you an inflationist or deflationist? There's a lot of mixed signals out there.
It's somewhat difficult to get your arms around a lot of this because you can look at the official statistics, and the official statistics will tell you that the inflation rate today is about 3%. There are several problems with these numbers. The first is that if you look inside the numbers, you'll find that food has been going up in price at about 6 to 8% for the last couple of years. But the bigger distortion that's in the CPI index, which is what everybody talks about as the inflation index, is that they count this thing called owner's equivalent rent as opposed to the price of houses. And that is the largest, the cost of housing is the largest single expense item in the CPI, as it is for most people. The cost of your housing unit, whatever it is, whether you rent or buy, is probably the largest single expense in your household. The owner's equivalent rent, however, is what your residence, if you own it, would rent for. Now think about what this means. As interest rates go down, the amount of money that somebody is willing to earn on a rental house as a percentage of the purchase price goes down. So as interest rates go down, even though the price of houses goes up, the owner's equivalent rent decreases. In other words, it doesn't increase at the rate of home price appreciation. This is a nasty distortion that goes into the system, and it basically says that the inflation we saw in home prices isn't really inflation. Well, you could have fooled me. Price of something's going up. That looks like inflation. Secondly, we have this thing called hedonic adjustment. They say, for example, that a liquid crystal television is 43% more better than a tube-type television. And therefore, if it's 43% more expensive, there hasn't been any inflation. Well, if your TV breaks, that would be great if you could still buy a tube set and choose not to have the so-called improvement in quality. Unfortunately, nobody makes those anymore. So you either pay 43% more or you get nothing, and yet this isn't inflation. All right? The reality is that, again, these statistics don't mean anything to the average person. What means something to people is purchasing power. How many hours of labor do you need to put in at your job in order to be able to drive your car 100 miles? How many hours of labor do you need to put in order to put food on the table for your family? Reduce things down into human output. Get the dollar issue out of this, because nobody cares how many $20 bills they have in their wallet. What they care about is what they buy. And this is where the distortion comes in, and it's used as a political tool, because if we start talking about inflation being what it really is, and inflation comes from changes in the credit supply, then we actually have to start talking about, well, how come senior citizens are getting hosed so badly with Social Security payments and things like this that aren't keeping up with the cost of living? That's the reason for the distortion. But when you look at what's really going on here, incomes, family income, in nominal terms, in other words, dollar terms, not adjusted for cost of living, have been flat since 2000. So for an adjusted for cost of living, we have been in a nasty secular decline in terms of people's actual purchasing power for a decade. And the credit expansion, whether it be in student loans, credit cards, home equity, whatever have you, was used to cover up this destruction of the middle class in America.
We are chatting with Karl Denninger, and Karl, we are out of time. Glad you joined us today. Very quickly, if someone wants to read your blog, where would they find your writings?
Market-ticker.org, and I have a book that was released in November called Leverage, How Cheap Money Will Destroy the World. You can find a link to that. Just click on the cover on the right-hand side.
Karl, love to have you back. Thanks for your time, and Everything Financial Radio will return on the Legacy Radio Network. After these words, stay with us.